Welcome to Sleepy History. Tonight we're stepping back into a world people think they know, but don't. A world that lives in video games, in fantasy novels, in slow-motion movie shots of heroes riding through mist with capes fluttering perfectly behind them. A world where armor shines, banners snap dramatically in the wind, and every sword swing lands with poetic precision. A world made of cinematic sunsets, noble sacrifices, and perfectly timed speeches right before battle. A world wrapped in myth, polished by storytellers, and romanticized in paintings and movies until it no longer even resembles the rough, uncomfortable truth it came from. A world of shining armor, noble quests, heroic duels, and chivalry whispered like a sacred word. At least that's what the movies tell you. The camera cuts away right before the horse poops in the courtyard, right before the knight spends half an hour trying to get a dent out of his helmet with a rock because the armorer is busy and annoyed, right before someone slips on a wet stone floor and remembers that medieval health insurance did not exist. It fades to black before the smell hits you, before the mud splashes up your legs, before the fleas decide you're tonight's buffet, and before you realize that plate armor plus a hot day equals slowly simmering human. But tonight, we're not watching a movie. We're not scrolling through a fantasy game inventory screen filled with perfectly polished gear and neat little stats. We're not following a spotless knight riding into battle with perfect posture, cinematic lighting, and a soundtrack swelling behind him as if the universe personally approves of his actions. No, we're walking into the mud, the discomfort, the cold drafts creeping through castle walls like unwanted guests that never leave, no matter how many fires you light. We're stepping into the heavy silence of early mornings when the training yard is still damp with dew, when the wood of the practice weapons is cold to the touch, and yesterday's bruises haven't faded yet. We're stepping into the endless chores, the sore muscles, the bruises beneath the armor, the swallowed pride, the arguments cut short because rank matters more than who's right. The nights where fear keeps you awake, even though your body begs for sleep. We're stepping into a life where your blanket smelled like smoke and sweat, where your dreams weren't of glory, but of aching shoulders and another day of drills, where every part of your body had a complaint, and none of those complaints mattered, where you learned very quickly that no one was going to ask you, "Are you okay?" before sunrise training. Because the real life of a knight was not glamorous, it was not elegant, and it was definitely, absolutely, unquestionably not clean. It was a life built on discipline, violence, exhaustion, routine, and more sweat than any human being should legally produce. It was a life where your body was a tool, your horse was your survival, your weapon was an extension of your arm, and every single day wore you down a little more. A life where your gear needed constant attention, your lord demanded constant loyalty, your tenants needed constant supervision, your priest demanded your repentance, and the weather seemed personally offended by your existence. It was a life where every day demanded effort, and every mistake demanded a consequence. Where you could do everything right, and still fail because someone else did something wrong. Where a loose strap, a frightened horse, or a moment's hesitation could ruin everything. Where glory was rare, pain was guaranteed, and survival was never promised. Where death wasn't a dramatic slow-motion moment. It was sudden, ugly, and sometimes completely pointless. A stray arrow, a bad step, a panicked horse, a splinter of wood in the wrong place. So dim the lights. Maybe grab a warm drink, something you don't have to boil 3 times just to make sure it doesn't kill you. Wrap a blanket around yourself if you want to feel cozy, because the knight you're about to meet never had that luxury unless he counted his slightly less damp cloak as a soft furnishing. Settle in, breathe slowly and prepare yourself, because we're about to peel back the polished steel and reveal the tired, overworked, sore human being underneath it. A man with calloused hands and aching joints. A man whose knees crack when he stands, long before he's old. A man who knows the weight of silence after battle, when the shouting stops and you suddenly hear the wind again. A man who knew the sound of battlefield screams as well as you know notification sounds. A man who carried not just armor, but expectations. Not just a sword, but the weight of duty. Not just a title, but the burden of surviving in a world where danger slept in every shadow. He wasn't just a warrior on a horse. He was a walking promise to protect, to obey, to fight, to bleed, to die if necessary, and to do most of it without complaint. The world around him didn't care how tired he was. It didn't care that his back hurt or that his hand still shook from the last battle. It only cared whether he could still lift his sword when it mattered. And trust me, once you see what knighthood was actually like, you'll wonder how anyone survived long enough to become legendary. You'll understand why so many died young. You'll see why, behind every shining armor suit in a museum, there is a story that is much less sparkling than the metal, and you'll realize that the knight did not choose the life. The life chose him, grabbed him by the scruff of the neck at 7 years old, and didn't let go. So let's go back to that moment. Let's begin where all great arcs begin. Not with glory, but with childhood. With the moment a boy's life stopped being his own and started belonging to duty, expectation, and a future written by other people. Forget the idea of a knight being born noble, majestic, and destined for greatness from the cradle. Forget the image of a little boy in miniature armor, practicing heroic poses in a sunny field while soft music plays in the background. Forget the idea of a child running through the fields with a wooden sword, dreaming heroic dreams in comfort and safety, cheered on by smiling parents. Most knights didn't begin their journey with a sword. They began it with a goodbye. They began it when their parents, quite literally, sent them away to someone else's house and said, "Good luck, don't die, and try not to embarrass the family name." Sometimes there were tears. Sometimes there were hugs. Sometimes there were prayers whispered over their heads. Sometimes there was just a quiet, heavy expectation that this is what noble sons do, so you will do it too. At around 7 years old, noble boys were shipped off to the household of another lord. A bigger lord, a richer one, a more powerful one, or at least one with the right connections. Not because medieval parents were heartless or uninterested, but because knighthood required brutal, structured, early training. Training that parents either couldn't give or didn't want to give. Your parents loved you, sure, but they also loved alliances, status, and the idea of you becoming useful. You weren't just a child. You were an investment, a bargaining chip, a future shield bearer of the family's reputation. You didn't get a vote. 7 years old. Think about that. Today, a 7-year-old is learning how to tie their shoes, sounding out words, maybe arguing about screen time. A medieval 7-year-old noble boy, he was learning how to hold a dagger without losing a finger, how to bow to a lord without tripping, how to carry a bucket without spilling it and getting yelled at by the cook, how to kneel in a chapel without fidgeting, how to keep his mouth shut and his eyes open. The journey itself could be terrifying. You might ride for days, away from everything familiar. Your home, your parents, your siblings, even the servants you knew by name, toward a castle or manor you'd never seen, full of strangers who would shape your entire future. The road was long, the air was cold, the world felt too big and you felt too small. At age 7, your life changed overnight. You stopped being a child and became a page. A page wasn't a title of prestige. It didn't come with applause. It didn't come with armor or glory or a fancy place at the table. It was all the jobs nobody wanted wrapped into one small, eager, slightly terrified body. A page was a message runner, a water carrier, a boot scrubber, a firewood fetcher, a table server, an errand boy, a door opener, a dog chaser, a cloak holder, and occasionally the unfortunate soul standing in the freezing cold, holding a torch because the adults refused to stand up. You were decorative when visitors arrived, lined up, cleaned up, trying to look presentable. The rest of the time you were functional. You carried messages across courtyards slick with rain and mud, trying not to slip while a knight's impatient shout echoed behind you. You memorized routes, from the great hall to the kitchens, to the armory, to the stables, to the solar. You learned who was important, who was dangerous, and who would help you when you were in trouble. You cleaned weapons that were bigger than your arms, wiping blood and rust off blades you were not yet allowed to use. You learned the names of each part of a sword before you were allowed to even lift one properly. Hilt, pommel, crossguard, fuller, words that would matter later. You washed mud off boots that never seemed to stay clean, no matter how hard you scrubbed. You scraped dried muck off spurs and tried not to complain when the smell stuck to your hands. You learned how to hold a knife properly, mostly to avoid stabbing yourself while serving dinner to people who would barely look at you unless you spilled something. You practiced manners, how low to bow, where to stand, when to speak, almost never, and when to disappear quietly. You learned to read the mood in the room. A tense silence meant don't make noise. Loud laughter meant stay alert because you might be called to refill cups. You learned who had authority to strike you and who didn't, but also that arguing about it was usually a bad idea either way. You learned to ride, not on a mighty warhorse, but likely on a stubborn pony who considered you more of a suggestion than a rider. You learned how to fall. You learned how to get back on, even when your backside hurt and your pride hurt more. You wrestled with other pages, got knocked into the dirt, and were expected to stand back up without whining. You played games that were also training, mock battles with sticks, tug of war, racing up towers, climbing walls you weren't technically supposed to climb. You ran errands. Then you ran some more. Then you ran again because someone forgot their gloves, their belt, their hat, or their temper. You fetched cloaks when the air turned cold, water when throats were dry, and more firewood when the logs burned down to embers. You learned how to light fires without wasting too much wood, how to carry jugs without breaking them, how to sweep rushes off flooring that never actually looked clean. You learned where everything was: the armory, the kitchens, the stables, the hall, the chapel, the storage rooms, the wine cellar you were absolutely not supposed to enter. You were the moving parts that kept the household running, and no one outside the castle would ever know your name. If you imagined your childhood filled with wooden swords and dragon fantasies, reality would disappoint you. Pages were basically miniature servants with the privilege of watching adults do all the dangerous things they would one day be forced to do. You learned by watching the knights train, the squires assist, the lord command, and the servants survive. You watched older boys being thrown to the ground, knights practicing with real steel, men-at-arms tightening straps on armor. You watched how everyone moved around the lord, careful, respectful, tense. You learned by copying. You learned by listening when no one thought you were listening. You learned by being in the background of everyone else's life. You learned that being invisible was sometimes a shield and sometimes a curse. And most importantly, you learned by messing up and paying for it. You dressed in hand-me-down tunics that never fit quite right, too long in the sleeves, too short at the hem, always slightly itchy. You ate last, after the adults decided they were finished, picking from what was left and trying not to look too hungry. You stood in the cold holding a torch while knights complained about everything from saddle sores to taxes. Your hands cracked from winter cold and rough chores. Your feet blistered from boots that rubbed in all the wrong places. Your muscles hurt from carrying, lifting, fetching, and standing for hours when all you wanted to do was sit down for 5 minutes. You learned that a drop plate could get you slapped, that a misplaced item could get you yelled at in front of everyone, that making a lord laugh could protect you for a day, and annoying the wrong knight could make your week miserable. And every single day you trained, running, jumping, climbing, falling again, falling much harder, learning how to get back up even when your body begged you not to, even when your knee stung and your palms burned and your pride felt bruised beyond repair. You learned to carry a shield half your size. You learned to drag sacks of grain until your arms trembled. You learned that tears were something you tried very hard to hide. You learned discipline long before you learned swordsmanship. You learned humility long before you learned honor. You learned pain long before you learned glory. Stories of heroic deeds were bedtime tales. Your reality was sore muscles and stern lectures. Your heroes were the squires who seemed unbreakable and the knights who barely noticed you. Your hands blistered from climbing ropes and ladders. Your arms ached from carrying equipment twice your size. Your back hurt from lifting shields, helmets, and weapons that felt heavier than your future. Your brain absorbed lessons on honor, etiquette, duty, obedience, religion, and how to survive in a world that didn't wait for the weak or the slow. You learned who you could talk to and who you absolutely could not. You learned which knight had a temper, which servant might sneak you food, and which corners of the castle were safe to sit and breathe for 20 seconds without being given another task. You learned the unspoken rules. Don't speak in the Lord's hall unless spoken to. Don't step in front of a knight. Don't argue with a cook. Don't ever be lazy where someone important can see. You learned how to pray, sometimes because you were pious, sometimes because you were scared, sometimes because everyone else was doing it and you didn't want to stand out. You learned that God was in every conversation, every oath, every fear about tomorrow's battle. Even as a child, you heard adults talk about sin, salvation, and war in the same breath. That was childhood, because from the moment you became a page, your entire existence pointed toward one goal: becoming strong enough to matter, strong enough to serve, strong enough to fight, strong enough to survive, strong enough to be given a horse, a sword, and the impossible expectation to use both without dying. Then at around 14, if you survived your childhood physically intact and emotionally stable, which was never guaranteed, you graduated to the next phase. You became a squire. Being a squire meant stepping up from small servant to slightly larger servant with more bruises and higher stakes. It meant stepping closer to the violence you had only watched from a safe distance. It meant walking in the shadow of the knight you served and learning every detail of that life whether you liked it or not. Now you followed a knight everywhere, into meals, into meetings, into training sessions, to the chapel, to the practice yard, to the hunting grounds, to the mustering field, and most importantly, into battles. Wherever he went, you went. Whatever he needed, you fetched. Whatever he dropped, you picked up. And whatever he yelled, you pretended not to take personally, even when it stung. You sharpened his swords until your fingers were sore and coated in metal dust. You learned the feel of a sharp edge and the sound of a dull one. You polished his armor until you saw your tired reflection staring back at you from the curved steel. You learned where each dent had come from. This one from a tournament, that one from a real battle, another from an accident you were not supposed to mention. You groomed his horse, sometimes more carefully than you groomed yourself, brushing dust from its coat, checking its hooves, adjusting its tack, talking to it quietly because sometimes the horse listened better than the knight did. You learned to recognize the animal's moods: restless before a storm, tense before a battle, relaxed after a long ride. You carried his shield, weapons, boots, bags, regrets, and emotional baggage. You learned how he liked his straps buckled, how tight his helmet should sit, which spur he preferred, which cloak he wore in bad weather, which saddle caused his back pain. You became an expert in one man's preferences because his comfort in battle might mean your survival too. You mucked out stables, breathing in the lovely aroma of horses that had been eating like kings. You lifted saddles heavier than your torso, heaving them onto restless animals who didn't always appreciate your effort. You endured the knight's temper, his pride, his frustrations with his lord, his worries about upcoming battles, his losses, his victories, his doubts that he would never admit to anyone but sometimes showed in the way he stared at the fire too long. You heard stories that never made it into songs. Stories of fear, stories of retreat, stories of men who froze in battle and never forgave themselves, stories of lords who made bad decisions and expected their knights to die politely for them. You were blamed for things that weren't your fault: a strap that broke, a horse that spooked, a helmet that went missing because someone else moved it. You were punished for mistakes you didn't make because someone had to be responsible, and it was rarely the knight. You were ignored until needed, and then expected to react instantly. In many ways, you were invisible and essential at the same time. You also trained endlessly. Sword drills at dawn, when the sky was still pale and your body hadn't fully remembered how to be awake. You learned how to cut, thrust, parry, recover, repeat. You drilled the same motions so many times, your muscles knew them better than your mind did. You learned to fight right-handed even if you were naturally left-handed because the world was not going to adjust to your preferences. Wrestling before lunch, rolling in dirt with other squires, slamming into the ground and tasting dust, getting thrown across the yard and expected to get back up again and again. You learned locks, throws, holds, and the unpleasant reality that sometimes the fastest way to win was the ugliest. Equestrian training in the afternoon, learning how to stay on a horse that seemed determined to test your balance and patience. You learned to ride without reins, to guide with your knees, to lean with the movement of the animal, to feel its fear and push through it. You practice riding in formation, trusting the horses and riders around you. You learn to couch a lance, to aim at a shield, to brace your body for impact. More drills at sunset when your arms burnt and your legs felt like lead, javelin throwing, shield walls, mock charges. You practice failing in controlled conditions so that maybe you wouldn't fail when it counted. You learn to hear commands shouted over noise. You learn to respond without thinking. Then chores late into the night because the castle didn't clean itself and your knight's equipment didn't magically shine. His mail needed oil. His plate needed checking. His straps needed mending. His boots needed drying. His horse needed feeding, watering, brushing, soothing. You slept less. You bled more. You collected bruises like other people collected stories. You learned how to take a punch, fall off a horse, lace chainmail, repair leather straps, stop a nosebleed, tape a swollen wrist, and not cry when your knight told you that your footwork looked like a drunk goat with 2 left legs. You learned to use a lance, a sword, a dagger, sometimes even a mace or an axe. You learned to fight on horseback and on foot. You learned that a knight who lost his horse and panicked was a dead man, so you practiced losing your horse and not panicking. You learned not just how to fight, but how to command a few men in battle, how to shout orders that made sense, how to keep small groups together in chaos. You learned how to read a battlefield where the ground was soft, where the slope was dangerous, where an enemy might break. But squires weren't just assistants. They learned how to fight. They sparred with real weapons, with blunt blades that still hurt when they hit you in the ribs. They trained with veterans who didn't care if you bruised or limped, because the enemy wouldn't care either. They learned how to kill, carefully, efficiently, and without hesitation. They learned which angle to hold a shield to deflect a downward blow, which stance could save your life, how to read an opponent's shoulders and eyes to guess when they'd strike, how to stay calm when a blade was inches from your skull. They learned how to fall from a horse and roll so they didn't break their neck. They learned how to fight on foot if their mount was taken. They learned how to help wounded comrades off a field without getting killed themselves. They learned what fear felt like in their bones and what it felt like to act anyway. They learned that courage doesn't mean feeling no fear. It means moving forward regardless. Because the truth was harsh. If your knight fell in battle, you didn't just lose a mentor. You inherited his responsibilities, his enemies, and every sharp object aimed in his direction. The man whose armor you used to buckle could suddenly be gone, and there you were, alone with his horse, his banner, and the expectation that you would step up. You might suddenly go from almost knight to you're all we have left, don't mess this up. A banner lying in the mud was dishonor. A squire standing there breathing was a solution. Your life could change in a heartbeat. Your training could end in a single mistake. Death could come from the front, the side, behind you, or from someone you didn't even see. You could do everything right and still end up trampled under hooves because the world did not care about fairness. But if you proved yourself, if you showed courage, discipline, resilience, and the ability to survive, then one day you might kneel before your Lord, bow your head and become something new, a knight. The moment of knighting is shown in movies as a calm, dignified ceremony, a noble hall, a velvet carpet, a wise king tapping your shoulder, everyone clapping politely, maybe a choir humming something spiritual in the background. You stand there looking noble, the lighting is perfect, the music swells. Sometimes that happened. Sometimes it was beautiful, symbolic, and filled with ceremony and prayer. Sometimes there was a vigil the night before, where you stayed awake in a chapel reflecting on your future, bathed in candlelight and silence. Sometimes you fasted. Sometimes you confessed your sins. Sometimes you were given a white tunic, as a symbol of purity that you deeply hoped you deserved. Sometimes you made promises you were terrified of breaking, to defend the weak, to uphold justice, to protect the church, to obey your Lord. Sometimes you believed every word. Sometimes you hoped you would grow into them, but sometimes it wasn't like that at all. Sometimes you were knighted in a smoky tent, 5 minutes before a battle, because they desperately needed more people on horses with pointy sticks. No carpet, No choir, just the smell of sweat and steel and an impatient lord saying the words as quickly as possible. Kneel, swear, stand, ride. Sometimes a dying knight grabbed your arm and said, "You're a knight now," because he needed someone, anyone, to finish the fight and carry his banner. No witnesses, no ceremony, just blood, panic, and a rushed blessing. Sometimes the ceremony lasted as long as the Lord's patience, which could be about 30 seconds between bites of roasted meat. Kneel, swear loyalty, take this tap on the shoulder, don't embarrass me, next. But no matter how rushed or lavish the ceremony was, becoming a knight instantly changed your place in society. You were now a mounted warrior, a symbol of your lord's prestige, a visible extension of his power, a heavily armed, highly trained announcement that this land belongs to someone important. You were a taxpayer's worst nightmare because someone had to pay for the horse, the armor, the weaponry, and spoiler alert, it wasn't you alone, but your existence was funded by the work of many others. You were the medieval equivalent of elite military, not common infantry, not militia dragged from the fields. You were heavy cavalry, armored, trained, dangerous. You had standing, status, honor, power, and you also inherited a responsibility with the weight of iron and the smell of danger. Wearing armor. Hollywood has done a fantastic job making medieval armor look elegant, balanced, and comfortable. Like a medieval superhero suit, sleek, stylish, perfect, gleaming in the sun, never dented, never rusted, just waiting for slow-motion shots as the hero walks in front of a burning battlefield. Reality was a little different. Let's start with the base layer, the gambeson. The gambeson was a thick padded jacket stuffed with wool, linen, horsehair, or anything that vaguely resembled protection. It was cramped quilting stitched into something that hoped to keep blades out and bones intact. It was heavy. It was bulky. It was hot. Wearing it felt like being squeezed by a bear who refused to let go, and also smelled faintly of old sweat and smoke. It absorbed sweat like a sponge. It absorbed rain. It absorbed whatever your life spilled on it. It held every odor you produced. When you took it off, it made a faint squelching sound you tried hard not to think about. It stuck to your skin. It rubbed under your arms. It made you feel like your own body was wrapped in a damp mattress, and yet you needed it. Without that padding, every blow that hit armor would transmit directly into your bones. A sword strike that missed your heart but slammed into steel could still break ribs. The gambeson was the difference between that hurt and I can't breathe. Then came chainmail. Tens of thousands of tiny metal rings linked together, weighing anywhere from 10 to 20 kilos just for a shirt. More if you had leggings. Chainmail was flexible, durable, and protective, but it also pinched, snagged, scratched, and distributed its weight like a jealous child hanging on your shoulders. Every movement made the rings shift and dig into the padding. Every step made the weight pull at your neck and hips. Every breath reminded you that your entire upper body was wrapped in metal. The mail jingled faintly when you moved, and that sound followed you everywhere, like the quiet reminder that your life required armor now. And don't forget the smell. Chainmail absorbed sweat like a medieval sponge. After a long day of training, you smelled like rust, labor, and tears. If it got wet in the rain and then dried, it carried that charming aroma of damp metal and old effort. The scent did not wash out easily. Cleaning mail meant oiling it and literally shaking it in sand or gravel to knock off rust. You didn't wash it like clothes. You tumbled it like an angry metallic salad. Then came the plate armor, if you could afford it. Plate armor was a masterpiece of engineering, custom-fitted, beautifully shaped, shockingly flexible when designed well. Artisans spent hours measuring every part of your body to make sure plates overlapped in just the right way. Around your shoulders, your elbows, your knees, each joint had to bend without exposing too much flesh. It allowed movement far better than the myths suggest. You could run, jump, climb, fight, and mount a horse wearing it if you were trained and strong. You could roll, kneel, rise, turn. Armor wasn't a prison. It was a second skin, a very heavy, very expensive, very noisy second skin, and still hot, still heavy, still capable of cooking you alive in summer. The metal trapped heat, the padding trapped sweat, the helmet trapped your breath. and you trapped your complaints because nobody cared if you were uncomfortable as long as you were effective. You didn't put armor on for comfort. You put it on because you wanted to remain a living person and not a historical footnote. Your helmet, your gauntlets, your greaves, your sabatons, each piece had to be buckled, tied, strapped, checked. You couldn't even fully armor yourself without help. You needed squires, servants, sometimes other knights to help lock you into your moving shell of metal. You were dangerous when armored, but you were also dependent. Now the helmets. Helmets reduced your hearing, narrowed your vision, echoed your breath back into your face, and turned every inhale into a steam bath. They pressed against your head, your brow, your cheeks. They were padded inside, but still managed to pinch something when you moved fast. You saw the world through slits. You heard through muffled metal. You breathed hot, stale air. Your voice sounded strange even to you. Your sweat ran down your forehead into your eyes and had nowhere to evaporate. You smelled your own suffering. Now imagine fighting in it. Before we get to battle, let's talk living conditions. People imagine castles as grand luxury fortresses, warm fires, cozy rooms, rich walls, soft furs, tables full of roasted meats and goblets overflowing with wine. A medieval 5-star hotel with stone walls and ambient torchlight. Castles were none of those things. Castles were cold. Stone absorbs heat about as well as a wet sock. Drafts slipped through cracks in walls and windows. Every hallway felt like a wind tunnel designed by someone who hated warmth. Winter turned interiors into unintentional freezers. Fires helped, but only if you stood practically on top of them and didn't mind your clothes occasionally catching sparks. Rooms were dark, lit by candles and rushlights that smoked more than they illuminated. Floors were uneven, often just packed earth or rough stone covered with straw or rushes that trapped dirt, crumbs, spills, and anything that fell. Furniture was sparse and not particularly comfortable. A bed was wood, ropes, a mattress stuffed with straw or wool, and an invitation to share space with whatever lived in it. Privacy did not exist unless you were very rich and very lucky. Rooms were shared. People slept in halls. Servants, squires, guards, they all lived close. Sound carried. Smells lingered. Knights slept on straw mattresses that housed a thriving ecosystem of insects, fleas, bedbugs, lice. They all got a say in your night's rest. They wrapped themselves in wool, fur, and hope. They listened to the wind whistling through gaps in the walls. They listened to other people snoring. They woke up stiff, cold, and coated in a thin layer of medieval misery. Bathrooms, buckets, outhouses, and the occasional hole in the floor where you prayed the wind blew downward. Because if it blew upward, well, you learned something new about suffering and air circulation. Chamber pots were emptied into cesspits or moats. The smell of a castle wasn't just wood smoke and roasting meat. It was also waste, sweat, animals, and damp stone. As for food, daily night meals weren't feasts. They were survival. Bread hard enough to chip a tooth if you weren't careful. Cheese that had questionable ideas about texture and longevity. Onions that made tears non-negotiable. Stew that was equal parts nutrition and mystery, full of don't ask, just eat. More bread, more onions. Ale that tasted slightly better than the water they refused to drink because stagnant water liked to kill people. Meat was a luxury, more common for nobles but still not guaranteed daily. Sometimes it was salted or smoked to last longer, which made it taste like salty leather. Fresh fruit was rare and seasonal. Spices were expensive status symbols sprinkled on food, more to show wealth than to improve flavor. Vegetables were whatever the land and season allowed. Cabbages, leeks, peas, beans, turnips. And everything tasted like smoke, salt, or disappointment, then hygiene. Bathing was not a daily activity, not even weekly for some. There were cultural differences in cleanliness, yes, and some periods and regions bathed more regularly than others, but nobody was taking long hot showers every morning with scented body wash. A knight might bathe once a month, or once every 2 months, or whenever the smell became a moral issue, or he was visiting somewhere fancy. Water had to be hauled, heated, poured. Baths were effort, labor that needed people and fuel. Nobody expected knights to smell good. They expected them to fight well, and smelling like a barn was considered normal, even respectable, as long as you didn't knock people out just by walking past. Night smelled like sweat, leather, horses, old wood, wet wool, smoke, and anyone unlucky enough to stand too close. Add in the tang of iron from weapons, the sourness of dried sweat in armor padding, and the occasional hint of garlic or onions, and you have a scent that could be described as medieval. Now, horses, because without them, knighthood doesn't exist. Horses were the backbone of knighthood. A knight without a horse was just a very overdressed pedestrian. He might still be dangerous. He might still be skilled, but he wasn't what people feared most. War horses, destriers, were massive, powerful animals bred specifically for combat. Broad-backed, strong-necked, with thick legs and heavy muscles. They cost more than most homes. They were assets, investments, and status symbols all at once. They ate constantly: hay, grain, time, money. They required grooming, training, and patience every day, battle or no battle. Their hooves needed care. Their shoes needed replacing. Their harnesses needed checking. They learned commands: how to turn, stop, charge, wheel around. They learned formations: how to ride in a line, in a wedge, in a tight group. They learned how to kick, bite, and trample enemies, whether on purpose or by opportunity. They became accustomed to noise, to shouting, to the clash of weapons, to the smell of blood. They were fighters in their own right, and they had personalities. A destrier might charge fearlessly into battle, ears pinned back, eyes wide, muscles surging beneath you. Or it might decide, for reasons known only to itself, that today was a good day to shy at a fluttering banner, or refuse to cross a ditch, or nip you in the shoulder when you weren't paying attention. Some were steady as stone, some were temperamental, some bonded deeply with one rider, some tolerated you as long as you fed them. You didn't just sit on them and steer. You built a relationship over years. You trusted them to move into danger with you. They trusted you not to drive them into something suicidal, and still nothing was guaranteed, because horses could be killed too. A spear to the chest, an arrow to the neck, a stumble in a hole. You could love your horse, rely on your horse, and lose your horse in one brutal moment. And then you were on foot, breathing hard, armor heavy, surrounded by chaos, which brings us finally to battle. Forget the choreographed duels Hollywood loves. Forget the clean clang of swords and witty banter mid-fight. Medieval combat was chaos, screaming, mud, blood, broken lances, flying arrows, exhaustion, fear, pain, noise, the smell of sweat, iron and earth, the sound of metal slamming against metal, wood splintering, horses whinnying in panic, men shouting prayers, curses, and final words. Battles were not elegant, they were brutal, confusing, messy, terrifying. Most people who were in them remembered flashes, not sequences, moments of horror and exertion, not hero shots. You swung until your arms burned and your shoulders felt like they were on fire. You blocked until your wrists ached and your grip started to loosen. You dodged, ducked, rammed, smashed, and shoved. You tried not to lose sight of your allies in the chaos. You tried not to lose your footing in mud or blood or bodies. You tried not to fall. You sweated inside armor hot enough to cook bread. You felt every extra pound of metal with every movement. You breathed hard, feeling your chest strain against padded layers. Your vision blurred with sweat. Your helmet rang like a bell when struck. You fought for your life every second, not for glory, not for a dramatic pose, just to stay alive long enough to see the end of it, and every moment you wondered if the next strike would be the last thing you ever saw. But armor, surprisingly, worked. It distributed force, prevented cuts, and protected your vital organs. A sword could skid off your breastplate. A spear could glance off your shoulder. An arrow might lodge in mail instead of in flesh. Armor turned killing blows into bruises, quick death into slow exhaustion. It kept you alive longer than anyone without it. But the weight, the heat, the exhaustion, those were the real enemies. Your muscles failed before your courage did. Your grip slipped. Your breathing grew ragged. Your reaction time slowed. A knight who was tired was a knight who might not raise his shield quite fast enough. After battle came injuries. Medieval medicine didn't have painkillers beyond wine, prayers, and questionable herbal concoctions. No antibiotics, no antiseptic, no sterile gloves, no IVs, no quiet hospital rooms with clean sheets and soft beeping monitors. A deep wound meant weeks of agony, if you were lucky enough not to die from infection. A broken bone meant months of limited movement if it healed straight at all. Infections were common, dangerous, and often fatal. Sometimes a scratch, a splinter, or a small cut killed you slowly and painfully. Physicians and surgeons did their best with what they had. They knew some herbs helped with pain. They knew how to set bones with splints. They knew how to cauterize bleeding with fire or boiling oil. They knew how to cut away dead flesh. They knew how to bandage wounds and hope. Sometimes their best worked. A well-cleaned wound, a stitched cut, a reset bone. Sometimes it didn't, and the patient faded no matter how many herbs were boiled. Sometimes the cure caused more pain than the wound, cauterizing, cutting, draining. Sometimes you were left with scars that pulled when you moved and a limp that never fully went away. Yet knights kept fighting, because honor demanded it. Duty required it. Their lords ordered it. Their families expected it. Their tenants depended on it. And society measured their worth, in part by their willingness to put themselves in danger. When knights weren't fighting, they weren't lounging around like retired heroes between quests. They were working, managing lands, overseeing harvests, making sure peasants didn't starve, and also didn't forget who owned the land, collecting rents and taxes from villagers who didn't want to pay but had no choice, checking boundaries, resolving disputes over fields, pastures, and streams, training for the next conflict, practicing archery, swordsmanship, lance work, commanding small groups of men, maintaining their gear, cleaning rust, oiling leather, sharpening blades, repairing dents in armor, replacing broken straps. Weapons and armor were expensive. Letting them rot was not an option. Serving their lords in councils, meetings, and ceremonies. Attending court, listening to politics, trying not to say the wrong thing to the wrong person, sometimes traveling with their lord on campaigns or diplomatic missions, sometimes being called upon as witnesses, jurors, or enforcers of justice, participating in tournaments, settling disputes between tenants, patrolling villages and borders, watching for bandits, raiders, or neighboring lords with overly curious soldiers, listening to complaints about livestock, fences, and water rights, solving problems, enduring politics. Knighthood wasn't a hobby. It wasn't an adventure you did on weekends. It was a job, full-time, exhausting, and demanding. You were never really off duty. Tournaments were the medieval sporting world, dangerous, theatrical, and prestigious. Jousting wasn't play. It was high-speed collision with real consequences. 2 armored riders, lances lowered, horses charging at full speed. Impact measured not in points, but in bones and splintered wood. A solid hit could unhorse a knight. A shot of lance could pierce a visor. A fall could break a neck. Broken bones, concussions, knocked out teeth. Internal injuries nobody understood. Occasional fatal accidents that turned entertainment into tragedy, while the crowd gasped and then, eventually, went home. Yet knights entered tournaments eagerly, for fame, money, and glory. Winning meant rewards, respect, maybe even patronage from a powerful lord. It meant people saying your name with admiration. It meant stories spreading about you farther than you could ever travel. Crowds watched. Lords wagered fortunes. Banners fluttered. Armor shone. Horses thundered. Musicians played, vendors sold food, and every joust felt like riding full speed into disaster while smiling politely for the audience. Then came chivalry. Chivalry wasn't about being gentle. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't even about kindness. Chivalry was originally a code about loyalty, bravery, military skill, discipline, duty, honor among fellow fighters. It dictated how you behaved toward your lord, your comrades, and sometimes your enemies. It tried to put rules on something inherently chaotic. War. Don't flee if your banner still stands. Don't abandon your lord. Don't break your oath. Don't kill prisoners who can be ransomed. Pay your debts. Keep your word, at least to people of your own rank. It said a knight should protect the church, defend the weak, at least in theory, uphold justice, as understood by the people in power. It was part ideal, part propaganda, part genuine attempt to create order in a violent world. The romantic version, saving damsels, writing poetry, being noble and gentle, came centuries later, mostly invented by poets who had never worn armor in their lives but had very strong opinions about love. Troubadours sang of knights pining for unreachable ladies. Writers spun tales of noble hearts suffering in silence. Reality was often less poetic. Real knights were flawed, human, tired, ferocious, loyal, stubborn, and bound by a code that often contradicted the reality they lived in. Sometimes they lived up to it, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes a knight could be brave in battle and cruel at home. Sometimes he could be pious in the chapel and ruthless in negotiations. Sometimes he could spare a defeated enemy and then overtax his peasants. They were not superheroes. They were people. People who bled, people who limped, people who aged too fast, people who fought hard and lived harder, people who made mistakes they could never undo, people who carried burdens they never spoke about, people who struggled to sleep at night, people who saw things on battlefields that lived behind their eyes for the rest of their lives, long before anyone had words for trauma, people who didn't always live long enough to retire and tell their stories. Many died in their 20s or 30s. Those who survived into old age bore the map of their life on their bodies, scars, stiff joints, fading strength, and the knowledge that one day they would have to hand their sword and horse to someone younger and hope he survived longer. Some older knights became mentors, training pages and squires, passing on the same hard lessons they had learned. Some became castellans, managing fortresses, balancing accounts, inspecting walls, worrying about supplies. Some tried to find peace in religion, going on pilgrimages, making donations to monasteries, praying more often in quieter chapels. Knighthood was a life built on discipline, on pain, on perseverance, on a willingness to carry metal on your body every single day, on the ability to face death with steady hands and steady breath, on the understanding that the world was harsh, and you had to be harsher if you wanted to survive. It was a life of duty, not comfort, responsibility, not luxury, hard training, not glamorous glory. It was a grind, not a montage. And yet, somehow, despite everything, knights left a legacy that shaped thousands of stories. Maybe it's because deep down, beneath the armor, beneath the grinding routine, beneath the bruises and exhaustion, knights represented something powerful. The determination to stand tall in a world that constantly tried to knock them down. Maybe that's what people saw. Maybe that's why the myths grew. Maybe that's why knights lived on in songs, poems, legends, paintings, and films. Because even when the details were distorted, the core remained the same. In a brutal, unforgiving world, they were the ones who kept getting back up. Because when the world was cold, brutal, and unforgiving, a knight was someone who refused to break, who strapped on armor again, even when yesterday's wounds still hurt, who climbed into the saddle again, even after seeing what could happen on a battlefield, who rode out anyway, into weather that stung his face, into danger that tightened his chest, into a future that might end in an instant. And that, more than the armor, more than the weapons, more than the myths, is why knights became legends,